Hey everybody, welcome to the Pooch and Rabold episode 29. I'm Ken Pooch Van Druten, and
This is Chris Rabold. What's going on, everybody?
How's everybody doing out there in this still crazy world gone mad? It just doesn't stop. It keeps getting...
It really doesn't.
The hole keeps getting deeper, but there is some stuff happening, right? Like you're about to go do a gig. That's exciting.
Yeah. I don't want to, I'm grateful, and I'm also, we'll talk about it after I've done it and everything's gone well.
Cool.
Cool. And I hope everybody hears me say that. I enter it with nothing but confidence, but I do. I'm like, I still got to go perform, So yeah, it's a broadcast thing.
Okay, cool.
It's something.
Yeah. I mean, dude, you get to work on a console and work on some audio. So, that's more than what I'm getting to do these days.
I hear you. I'm stoked. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Cool. It's funny. I just talked to a friend of mine who just got back from Sturgis.
Oh, I know. I saw that.
Yeah. And he was one of the mixers out there. And he actually said that, like, the Sturgis people, or the what's that place called? The Buffalo Chip people, were actually doing everything that they could and trying to follow all the CDC guidelines. Like, they were driving mixers to front of house so that they didn't have to walk through the crowd.
That's cool.
And as far as stagehands go, they were kind of socially distancing and only having, a limited amount of them. And so he said they were doing everything that they could to try to, stay within the CDC guidelines. And so I thought that was promising.
Yeah, it's encouraging.
Yeah.
I saw it with the show in the UK too. Did you see that? Where they kind of had people. There was some show with like a festival. I just glanced at it on social media. It looked like a real stage festival type scenario, and then somehow they had people cordoned off in little boxes. And
what? I did see that. Yeah. Let's put everyone in a little box. That's so weird.
I know. I mean, but you see these places in the world where it's like they're at least pulling that off.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
there's hope.
I think it's exciting that they're at least trying. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So hopefully that'll lead us to a path of working, and I'm sure that we'll probably have some broadcasting opportunities like what you're getting to do this week, hopefully coming up. So keep your heads up, guys out there. Keep moving. We're going to get through this. There is light at the end of the tunnel. That's my whole point about all that.
True. Very true.
Before we started today, we were kind of talking offline. I had just, I think this is a couple of weeks ago, maybe even, or a week ago at least, Andrew Sheps and Jack Joseph Puig had a live Facebook thing for this PeerMix.net, I think it is. Anyway, it was 4 hours of those two talking, which, by the way, both of those, I feel like those two guys are the most influential on myself, living engineers, modern era engineers, living engineers that are still doing it and making records. Those two guys, Andrew Sheps and Jack Joseph Puig, are my favorite to learn from and to, gain knowledge. So I was excited to have a 4 hour thing, to be able to watch and check them out. And if you have some time, you guys should go watch that. It's very interesting. But some of the things that they were talking about were really interesting. And you and I were kind of chatting about them offline. So I don't know, where do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to verbalize the inspiration, but it seems like we're gonna talk about how we set the scene musically with a mix. But we should start by, how do we do that, in theory, in our heads, before we even touch a fader, before we bring an input into the console. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but the impetus for this was they were kind of talking about meeting the expectations of the artist, but then also juggling some of the inevitable maybe insecurities of the artist, or, you know, some of the real world factors that will play into how you think about building your mix. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely it. And, you know, a big part of this in their discussion, and rightly so, I think we should be discussing about, is people get lost in the gear. You know, Jack Joseph Puig is now, especially now, but Jack Joseph Puig is known worldwide for this amazing couple of rooms that he owns, where it's, you know, all this huge, amazing millions of dollars worth of analog gear and all that kind of shit. And basically he was sitting there saying, guys, it's not about the gear, man. It has nothing to do with the gear. It's about getting across the emotion of the artist, and creating a safe space for that artist to work in, so that they can musically get that stuff across. So I think it's interesting that he's talking about, we all get lost in, you know, what plugins are you using? You know, what, you know, what's your favorite console? What's, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I think we don't talk enough about the emotional part of this, and how you and I mean, I spend a great deal of time trying not to think about my gear and how to get the emotion of an artist across. And I know that you do too. You've spoken about this before, where you before you've said how you feed off the crowd and emotionally mix that way. Can you talk to that a little bit? Like, how is that for you?
Yeah. There are two, I can't remember who I was talking to the other day. There are the two things that drive me the strongest, the two metrics, sets of checks and balances that I have in my head at all times. One is the unrealistically high set of expectations that I place on myself, that I have cautioned everyone about. And I have my own bar, right? And it's set at a certain point. That's the first one. And it's based on memories. It's based on experience. It's based on expectations. And then the second is literally feeling and looking around the room. And that too is built on those same things. It's built on years and years and years and years and years of sitting in crowds of all different sizes and noticing the things that I do, how they literally make people move, like literally how their bodies move, you know? And that's how I judge how I'm doing, you know? Those two things. And then I guess, if really, now that we're talking about it, if I succeed in both of those, I then feel very encouraged at what the artist is seeing. And that, I get off on that too. It like, oh, they know. They don't, I mean, not that they're thinking consciously, Chris is really doing it tonight. But they know that it's happening. And A, that makes them perform better. And then B, it just bodes well for me when it comes up in conversation, you know. And that's how, with what those guys were talking about, and dealing with an artist and expressing the emotion and the intent with the artist, if you can deliver for an artist in that way, that artist, particularly as they get bigger in stature, or hell, there's rock stars that play for 3 people that are the biggest egomaniacs in the world. They will drop some of that guard with you because they trust you. And then you can sort of push past where a lot of people would usually go with them, and you can be frank with them, and you can be honest with them. And I was thinking to myself the other day, of all the things I miss, which is just a loud kick and snare in my chest and a crowd and all these things, I miss those little wins with artists too. When I'm like, you know, when you can like level with them and be honest with them in a way that people usually don't, because they trust you. Like, that's a good feeling. So, yeah, that's how I judge that's how I judge my value, in on a nightly basis are those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, I think that we have the luxury of, you know, having rehearsals, and having connection with an artist that could come in and listen to stuff, while we're doing rehearsals. In fact, I invite that all the time. I'm like, whatever artist it is, I'm like, hey, come in, listen, so that we can talk about it. And what I find very interesting about that is 99.9% of the time, they don't give a shit how you got there. They're just listening to see whether or not you made that emotional connection, whether your mix is translating that emotion, and getting the emotion that they're trying to get across from their song. But they don't care what gear you have. I mean, even guys like, I know Bruno's like really hip to stuff like that, right? Like he knows the gear, he knows what's hip, and he knows what's good.
He knows the visual. And I've talked about it on here before. That's one of the reasons I still use Pro Tools is I know to me though, it's like, not because I expect an artist to come in and go, oh, cool, you're on Ultimate, sick. Like but I know they're going to come in and be like, subconsciously, I've been here before. I feel comfortable here. You know what I mean? Right. But no one gives a fuck how you got there.
I know. So that's what I always tell people. It's like, don't get lost in this. Now, something that I want to travel down a rabbit hole here in a minute. That is really interesting. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about how important balance is in all of that. I think we've talked about balance before, but one of the things they were also discussing in this thing that I thought that we should point out too is like how many times during a rehearsal period, let's say, where you've got a song going on and your mix is happening and you're like, man, it's just something's not right. Something's not right. And you pull all your faders down and like start again to create balance. Do you do that?
Oh yeah. Often.
I do it all the time. When something isn't working, I don't start soloing things up. I don't start reaching for EQ. I don't start reaching for reverbs. I don't do whatever. I go, you know what? None of this is working. 100 faders all the way down and let's start again.
Yep.
And, so then I start balancing a drum kit by itself and getting it balanced. So then it's being controlled by a single fader, but its balance is all correct again. Right. And then the same thing with the bass guitar, with the guitar, and so on. So I just I can't stress enough how much balance is important. And if you are struggling in a mix, then to me, it's like balance will help you get so much further than like trying to figure out what compressor or plugin you should put on that stuff.
Totally.
Do you have any other part of balance that you do that is a tip for these guys?
I feel like we could go for a while on this one. With balance, it's interesting because we are mixing live sound and because there is a physical component to live sound. One could argue there's a physical component in all aspects of audio, just turn it up loud enough. But for us, there is. The SPLs we mix, there's a physical component. So what I'm saying with that is I do start with the drums, but the drums don't really become clear to me until they have reached some threshold of a physical line. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like they have to, so like that's why grabbing that drums, like I keep all of my drums on one VCA. Whenever I pull it down, it throws the balance off. Even if the shit needs to be quieter, it's because it loses the physical component. And that's part of our balance. So I have to start where the physicality is, which is in the drums. So I'll do the same thing, man. I'll pull everything down. I'm really bad too. If it's a show, I'm going to be dead honest here. If it's a show and no one's listening to the board tape and I think I can get away with it for a minute, I will take 3 guitar VCAs and mute them for a second in the middle of the fucking show because I know no one's asking for their money back. If it's like during a verse, the vocals, I'll be like, fuck it. I knew it. That's where the problem. You know what I mean? Like I'll do that.
Yeah.
And I'm being honest. If someone's listening, I won't do that. But I will do that because I know I'll get away with it and life will go
but
on.
I mean, it's just a moment in time. It's not like
It's
we're
a
muting it
brief
for the
moment.
entire song. It's like
Right.
we're just, I can't tell you, and you've done that. I don't mean to interrupt you, but
Let's go.
I can't tell you how many times where, and we do this all the time, and it's part of what makes someone a good mixer is constantly reevaluating. And
Yes.
during a show, I constantly reevaluate what my balance is. I mean, let's not forget that balance is also EQ, right? Like volume and balance. EQ is just adding more high end or less low end, whatever. Those are all
an amplitude thing.
That's right. Those are all amplitude things. So if I really boil down to what I'm doing as a mixer for most of the time, it's evaluating my balance. And sometimes when it's just not working, and it happens a lot, I'll be in the middle of a show just going, fuck, I don't know what is wrong.
And it sucks when you've been doing it for a year.
Yeah.
And it's the same song and it's the same spot and you tried everything and you're just like, a lot of times it's not reevaluating. It's just like reaffirming. Like, I know what it is. It's this one track and you'll dip it. Just pull it for a second. You're like, I know it. God, but I have to,
it has to be there. It has to be there. Yeah, I know. So yeah, it's this reevaluation of balance.
Well, and to continue the thought, as I do the same thing is what I'm saying. I'll start over. I'll scrap it. And I'll pull those drums up to anchor them in a place. And of course, I'm also looking at headroom because I'm thinking I got a lot of other things coming. That's where are we going with this? And then I do that. it always starts with the rhythm section for me. Actually, I think I've mentioned it on here too. Now, if I have full tracks, but like nothing's really mixed yet, I'll turn the bass on and just pull it up at some arbitrary level, just so I'm not listening to just kick drum. Of course I will, but I need to give it some reference, and that'll keep you from digging too deep into the inputs. But yeah, it starts with the rhythm section, drums, bass, and then I'm just pushing things to where I want them. And again, because in live sound, because we've got these things working against it's like signal to noise, which again, guys, we're talking about crowd to audible level of, we've got this tiny window. We're at larger SPLs. There's all these things where you kind of have this small window where to put stuff, where I'll just kind of just start moving the furniture around a little bit, and that's before we get to the vocal.
Totally.
And that's where the real talk about trying to figure out what people want. I've noticed, if anything, vocals I feel are getting lower in live mixes with artists that are really paying attention, because if it's a live vocal, and I mean a real live vocal, and it's not tuned, and even if it is tuned, you can't melodyne it live. People are used to perfect vocals now, and we cannot deliver a perfect vocal. And so those, whereas if anything, I'll mix vocals too loud, because that's a major win and it just seems right. But like now, man, I feel vocals are kind of coming in because you just can't. Somebody's like, I can, I'm sure you can, but we can't deliver that.
Yeah.
Live. We can still deliver a stellar vocal, but as far as the tuning and all that level of polish, and so artists are kind of asking me more and more now, like, pull that, even a confident vocalist, like just pull that down a little bit.
It's funny that you say that, because I hate that. I want my vocal to be super loud and proud.
And then as a mixer, you want that. That's a big win.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people are paying, I don't care if it's a band, they're coming to hear the words and hear every nuance of the vocal. To me, the vocal is the most important input. It doesn't matter if it's the Rolling Stones and people love, what Ron Wood is doing. He doesn't matter like Mick matters. You know what I mean? It's like, and so I'm like you, I tend to mix vocals probably louder than I should. Well, I don't know if I'm going to say that, but I mix them loud. They need to be loud and proud. They need to be there. And so that trend that you're talking about, I'm getting it too. And I think it sucks. I think that you should try to convince your artist that it's okay to have a little bit of flaws, that
Right.
it's okay to not be exactly the record, you know?
Yep.
But
It's the newer artists that have grown accustomed to the perfect vocal
yeah,
that are struggling with that more.
yeah,
You know, and a lot of times they can't verbalize what it is. In fact, I've had some people where I can tell, like they're sort of unhappy with. I can tell they're unhappy with something with the vocal, but they can't quite
verbalize it.
I'm like, I know exactly what it is. It's not, you know,
yeah, totally, totally.
So, but a lot of times an older artist, like they're okay with the imperfections, you know.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Back to balance just a little bit, because there's an interesting story that Jack told that I thought was really telling. You know, one of his mentors was Glyn Johns, and if you don't know anything about Glyn Johns, you should go research, because that dude has made amazing records, which I really found it made my heart warm, because actually when I went to college, one of our projects was to study a specific producer, pick your favorite producer and talk about all the things that he's done. And one of my ones that I chose was Glyn Johns. So I was like, not only do I love Jack, but I love the guy that he loves. You know what I mean? So that was really cool. But what he told me what he told was a story about Glyn Johns working with a band, and I think it was the Rolling Stones. I'm not sure. Anyway, it was a really well-known act. He had been getting everything together and been working on this mix for a long period of time, and finally the band came in and started listening to the mix, and one of the band members' comments was, hey, this sounds amazing, but can we just turn the bass up just a little bit? Just turn the bass up a little bit. And he reached and pulled every fader back to zero, all of them. And the band went, whoa, wait a minute, dude, that sounded amazing. Like, what are you doing? Why did you just ruin your mix? And he said, because you can't just turn up the bass. You have to rebalance everything for the bass. Yeah. So I think that's super telling of like how balance is important and what it means. That should tell you that it's not about just turning things up and down and there's this weird trend, man. Have you seen this where people claim that they can get balance without even listening, like using an analyzer and being like, I can balance a mix without even having the speakers on. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? That is not
like looking at the mix.
Yeah. Like a spectrum analyzer. And I was just like, what are you talking? And literally this is the thing, like, believe it or not, there's people, it's more of a studio thing, not obviously not a live thing, but there are people that argue that they can do that. And I just go, you know what? Balance is not numbers. It's not looking at an RTA, and it's about your hearing and about people don't realize like how much resolution the human ear has. Like, think about it. It's the only sense that is 3D. Our eyes only have this much space. Like, I can't see behind me right now, but our ears can hear shit behind us. So it is a super sense. It is something that has, placement of depth and height and 360 degrees spatial recognition about where things are. So nothing can replace your ears, especially when we're talking about, building a mix using balance. And
that's what the joke too about the notion that you could just, look at a spectrum analyzer and come up with a mix, because what we're talking about is summation across the board. It's summation. Like, somebody asked me recently, they're like, so what do you do? And I'm like, I've started using this analogy a lot. I'm like, I cook. You give me the ingredients and I cook. And at a certain point, if you've put too much salt in, it throws everything off, And that's what you're saying. Once you've turned the bass up a little, now all the relative balances are thrown off. And I've mentioned on here too that I struggle. I was practicing the other night and I noticed, and I'm like, oh, here we go. I start listening to the hi-hat or something. And next thing you know, guess what the mix is all about? Is the hi-hat. And it's like, and as soon as I start focusing on it, and that's when shit just starts creeping up louder and louder and louder, and boom, you're clipping. As soon as you turn one thing up, you got to turn the other one up. You got to turn this. And I thought that's what you were going to say, is instead of turning the bass up, he just turned everything down a little. He went far further than that.
Way further than that. He said, I have to rebalance all of it now. If you want the bass louder, then we have to fix all of it. And he's right. Yeah, I mean, the other part of this that I always tell people is something that you just touched on about all of a sudden your mix is all about hi-hat. Get perspective. Like I certainly during rehearsals walk away from a mix a lot and force myself to take breaks. And the reason that I do that is I know if I take a 5-minute break away from something that I've been chipping away at for 5 hours, you know what I mean? I've just been chipping away, working. And if I go get a coffee for 5 minutes and come back, the first 15 seconds of listening to that, I know exactly what's wrong with it. It took that time to get away from it for a minute. Had I kept working and not taken that 5-minute break and gotten perspective, I think I'd still be digging myself a hole, right?
And those breaks are hard because, you tell yourself, you're like, step away, just step away. And I don't know about you, but me, the whole time in my head, I'm just like, can I go? Can I go back? Can I go back? Can I go back? Sometimes what I'll do is if it's rehearsals, I usually have 2 listening levels. I have like loud, and then I have this quieter where I kind of get perspective.
Yes.
And those are my main 2. And usually what I'll do is sometimes I'll take it to that bottom one and just loop it, hit play and leave. So I walk in, not just with perspective with hands on the desk, but walking into the room.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never done that. That's great.
Yeah, I do that. And oftentimes it makes me feel a little bit better, really. Some guy asked me recently, hit me to send a message or something like that. Somebody I've been working with, and he was talking about this phenomenon. And he's like, do you walk? What do you do? And like, I don't walk the room or anything, but I do just take a couple steps back. Just take your fucking hands off the desk. Because there's something about when they're on there, you're in like scientist mode a lot of times, and you're just analytically picking things out. When you let go, you're forced into listening to music mode. Those breaks super important.
Totally important. I do exactly what you say. I'm not the guy that walks the room either, but I do purposely walk out of the sweet spot of the stereo sweet spot. I walk out of that to see what happens to my where I've placed things. Remember, we've talked a lot about how
I'm grinning. Sorry, because that can be a shocking.
Man,
3 steps to your left. Like, what have I been doing?
Because we emphasize a lot about how placement and depth and height and all of these things are important in your mix. And they are the most crucial when you're in the sweet spot of the stereo thing coming at you. But unfortunately, only 5% of the crowd is in that sweet spot all the way to the front. So, of course, speaker technology is pretty great these days. So the shift of the stereo spectrum is pretty good when you're walking left to right. But it's not just like the sweet spot. So I do on purpose, and if you guys don't do this, you need to get up and walk outside of the front of house barricade. You know what I mean? Yep. And be like, so when I'm over on the right-hand side, all my stuff on the left-hand side is not really coming through as I thought it would,
Right.
And then that kind of changes my perspective of things too. But, one of the other things that they were talking about, which is a really like rabbit hole, I think is, okay. So Jack has this whole thing, and this is a long conversation. You can go look online and see where he talks about this, but what he talks about is compression being a time changing tool. So for instance,
I'm so into this and I don't even know exactly where this is going. But
it's really interesting. His All right. The Fisher Price version of this is basically you can change the feel of a rhythm section by deciding where your attack and release is in compression, right? You can physically, he gives an example of this. So, for years, people had to play before Pro Tools existed, and the feel of a bass player being behind a drummer's feel, was kind of what made a lot of those records be great. Well, then Pro Tools comes along, and everybody starts lining up everything on a grid, and it totally changes completely the feel of everything. So then people started to say, okay, well, now we're just going to take, a track of a bass guitar and shift it just a little bit just to get that feel back. It was all lined up on the grid. Now we're going to move it a little bit, whatever. But his argument is that a better way to do this, obviously, is leave the shit alone and don't grid everything up. If you've got good players, but if you don't have good players and they have to get kind of lined up, his solution to that is choosing the right compression for different instruments, and the right amount of attack time and release time in order to force the time tangent to be a little bit different, right?
Yes.
So I'll let you speak to this, and then I'll talk about it a little bit too, how, I can't stress enough, if you don't know what we're talking about right now, go get either a plugin or the real thing, and put an 1176, for example, or the CLA 76 or whatever, put the 1176 on all kinds of things, snare drum, bass guitar, vocal, and leave the ratio the same, but adjust the attack time and the release time on different instruments and see how much that changes your world. Just the adjustment of attack and release on an 1176 with the same ratio can take a single input and completely change it in time and in sound and in, all kinds of things. So basically what he's stressing is that you can really kind of make a feel happen by messing around with compression. So talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm chomping at the bit on this one because this is I've said before, I use a lot of effects, but I'm not an effects guy. I'm a dynamics processor guy.
Me too.
That's where my shit is, know. And God, I could go on forever about this. But as you were talking, I'm thinking it's funny. So I mentioned I have this broadcast thing coming up, and I'm making a show file for it.
Right.
And I'm dropping in all of these. I'm just making presets within. I'll just tell you, it's on what is it? Quantum SD7. What do we call that now? Quantum 7?
Quantum 7. There's no Quantum SD 7. Part of that. It's a Q7. No SD.
Q7. Right. So I'm making all of these presets for the internal shit, but then I'm also going to use waves. I'm going to get a little slutty, but I'm making all of these presets because I want to have them in my back pocket. And guys, I am making presets. I can look at these things and I've done it long enough where I know what I want the attack and release to be. And sometimes it's only a couple milliseconds difference on the attack and maybe 100 or 200 milliseconds difference on the release. That's how important it is. That's also what I now know. Now I reserve the right to be wrong and I reserve the right to tweak. But when you're talking, I'm thinking, you can change the sonic structure of something with compression. You can change essentially the time domain. You can take a snare drum, take a liberal attack time. And if it gives you a numeric value, go to 10 milliseconds. So it gets through, and you'll notice, and now that I say that, I know that the Avid defaults to 10 milliseconds. I think there's a reason you see that 10 millisecond up. It's basically not committing. You're letting some shit by, but not a ton. So start somewhere around there. Take that release, go down to 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. And then as you lengthen that release, that drum seemingly gets deeper.
Yes.
Then you'll get to the point where you're smothering it and the next hit doesn't work, but you know what I'm talking about?
Totally
You can lengthen the size seemingly of these instruments.
That's exactly right. Yep.
That's right. And then on bass, I love things I love precision. I don't like gridded out stuff. Fortunately, we can't do that live, but I like release times that are just long enough to do what it needs to, then come back in time. But like if you take a LA2A, man, once that thing gets into compression, it just hits this wave of gooiness. I don't know what the fuck it's doing. And it's a 2-stage release, apparently, where there's actually 2 different time constants that determine the release. You can't select shit on that one. But as much as I love like a band, where I'm going with this is I was playing the other night, and I was going between like an 1176, LA2A, and then some other stuff. And as much as I love the precision I can get out of the 1176 on the release, even if it's like a slappy poppy thing where it needs to be a quick release, there's something that happens once it gets into, and that's why vintage gear is so revered. There's just this magic when it's living in this thing, and it just creates this, it might not be technically right, but it creates this sound and this vibe, and it can sit things in a mix in a really wonderful way. And same thing with the vocal. Definitely do it, those quicker release times are very popular nowadays because they're very in your face. Quicker release times make things the attack matters greatly too, but the quicker release time, it just makes it more present. The longer kind of sits it back, but yes, sit there with the vocal and just pull it back and see how the vocal sits versus jumps. And there's so many different ways you can do things. Acoustic guitars, you can lengthen them and make them chunkier, or you can make them spikier, or, there's so many different things you can do with this. And what we're talking about here is truly the art.
Totally.
It's the art of it. And we're talking about, it's not about the gear, but when you start to have knowledge of gear, like the LA2A, I'm telling you, I don't know what the fuck it's doing. Once it gets into that never ending, it can do it at 2 dB. It doesn't have to be at 10. Like it just never makes it back to 0. That's magic. But then also have the knowledge of what your stock digital compressor does when you have to the microsecond variability.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing up a great point that, gear, it's not about the gear, but it is about the gear in that when I'm thinking about developing emotion in my mix and providing a feeling, I have this toolkit that is in the back of my brain of 60 different plugins or 60 different compressors that I know that each one of those things, what they do well. And the only way that I know that is I've experimented with gear for a lot of years and been like, well, let me try putting something through this. Oh, you know what? That does something really well. And so I kind of have this library in the back of my head that I access every once in a while in regards to the emotion of the mix. So when I say, gear isn't important, it is important. You need to know I have this toolkit that I can grab from. And you should be experimenting with all kinds of different plugins and, whatever you can get your hands on so that you can develop your own, library of things to grab when someone says, hey, I'm looking for such and such. I can't think of an example right now, but I'm looking for something that pushes the vocal way forward. You can go, I know exactly what tool will do that. Something I wanted to get back to as far as time and compression is that think about placing the transients of things so that they're not on top of each other, right?
Yes.
So when a kick drum happens and the point of a kick drum is, say, this point in time, I want to make the point of the bass guitar not be exactly in that same point. I want it to be a little bit over here if we're talking about time.
Right.
And compression is the way that you do that, right? Like changing the attack time of the bass guitar to make the transient be a different place than the exact time that they played with the kick drum. The bass guitar is locked into the kick drum, and that's great. But by shifting the transient just a little bit with the compression, man, you can feeling happen. And this is, we're talking about, this is like advanced level. This is along the same lines I think we spoke about before about creating depth and 3D-ness in a mix and height. Like height is the hardest for me to try to figure out how to, left and right, I can figure that out. That's pretty easy placement wise. Depth is a little bit harder. I do that a lot, like with EQ, making something less sparkly has the appearance of it being further away. Right. So sometimes it's weird. It's like sometimes I choose certain microphones to not be super full range on purpose because I know that I'm going to place that thing depth wise in my mix deeper. So for instance, like background vocals, the microphone choice on a background vocal, I might not choose to be that super crispy lead vocal thing. I want it to be more have, a little bit duller and a little bit have a characteristic of it being a little bit duller because I know that in my mix, I'm going to place those backgrounds in a depth way, further away from me.
Get it.
So those are advanced, higher level thinking when you're mixing on top of the balance. All of these things are like constantly what's going on inside of my head, and I know for you too. Height, I have trouble with, like trying to get that
because that speaks to the headroom, and that's why it's crazy. Like you've talked about classic records, you talk about classic records a lot. Like, and I just saw where Off the Wall is 39 years old this week or 40. Some, Quincy Jones. Man, listen to that shit. The snare drum is 30 feet tall, but they're working within the same dynamic range that we have now. So that's where, how do you make something have, that's the height. That's very, very difficult. I didn't mean to sidetrack you there.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I was going to say, what you're talking about is, like we've talked about side chaining, that you and I don't do a lot of side chaining. It's just not, again, unless you're doing EDM when it's specifically for this like sucking, pumping sound. And I think it's because maybe not that we're dinosaurs, but we came up in a time when people weren't side chaining a lot, like side chaining the bass to the kick to make the kick poke. Like we were using either EQ or dynamics. And so that's like, these are ways of doing that to figure out who has the leading edge, who's the leading edge on this. It's so funny you mentioned this today. I was driving down the road thinking about snares and overheads. And I was thinking about how it's cool when you've got an overhead sound that's like full of snare, but aside from the fact that you'll have too much snare than cymbals, that's also how you're like, why am I clipping? And it's the summation of the two. You kind of need to make, again, it's all about summation. How are these things going to all live together? And if everything's fucking four to the floor right from the jump, it's just going to be too much. So you've got to kind of shave the edges off of some things, make other things a little pointier, and that's what's going to build that's what's going to build your house,
It's, like we've said on here a bunch of times, it starts with the source. The best case scenarios are the guys that, musicians that have honed their craft and honed their instrument to have a tonality about it that is amazing. But past that, it's your job as an engineer to get emotion from a mix. These are some of the tools that you could do, like, manipulating the point of a kick drum to be a little bit off of where the bass guitar is, or, vocals even, having a faster attack than you would normally. All of those things matter. Like it all matters, and it all changes the feel of things. And so I guess I can't, we've talked about in the past about you guys, getting a third octave EQ and just learning ear training about EQ and ear training about frequencies and training yourself. What's that? But I think it's equally as important to learn about compression because it matters so much in time domain. you know, and people don't think about that, you know, you know, the time domain can be altered using compression.
Yep. And you'd be surprised how many people don't. I have a very, 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 very good friend who is a successful engineer as you can get on this planet. And I swear to God, he would have no opinion on any of this. And yet somehow he pulls it off. I mean, every compressor is set to stun. It is set to fastest attack. The release is just whatever it was on. And somehow he pulls it, like, you know, somehow he'll pull it off.
That's really interesting. Well,
yeah,
I mean, you know, listen, there are a million different ways to get there. You and I are sharing, and part of what we love about each other is that we are pretty similar. We're similar, but we get there in different ways.
Yes.
But we are similar. Like, you know, we are not the guy that you just described.
No.
But somehow he's able to pull that off. So how are we to say
I know. It's almost just like an anecdote of saying, you don't have to be this. And there's beauty in that. Like, that's the kind of guy that just walks up and just does it. And everything's wrong and everything's clipping. The instructors sucks. And blah, 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 blah. And they laugh all the way to the bank. And I mean, you can do that. You can be that. I think that's why I think that's also what's resonating with this whole thing we got going on here in people is that I have to know the why in it. You know, I'm a cerebral mixer, but I think about how we're going to get there and why we're going to get there. But I also oftentimes am surprised at the things that work. I'm like, that doesn't necessarily make sense. But like, I struggle with when it comes to compression on keys, I have several different theories on the best way to do keys. And it is all dependent on the song and what we're trying to convey. Like, do I want that piano to have attack? Do I want it to have attack, or do I want it to sit there? And that's when you get into really fine line stuff. But at least I know, okay, if I want it to do this, I'm going to do this. And if I want to do this, I'm going to do this. So, you know, again, we're encouraging you guys and gals out there to, you know, hone that toolkit in your knowledge base so that you can do these things.
Yeah, I think keyboards are some of the hardest. You know, it's like, so their frequency spectrum is so wide. It takes up so much of your mix, like trying to figure out where all that lies. It's like some of the hardest things to get right.
It means a million things. It can mean a super dynamic piano, or it can mean a Moog that's just this block of power that you're like, you know, it can be, oh man, those are the hard, to me, that's the hardest stuff. Acoustic guitars and keys. That's the hardest stuff.
Yeah, it totally is. Totally is. So one of the things I also was thinking about, and you kind of touched on it earlier, which was the, you know, getting so focused on a single thing in your mix. And I've kind of like overanalyzed how I work, and I'm curious to know maybe what your thought process is, but I feel like if you could see inside my brain, which you don't want to go there, but if you want to get there, you definitely don't want to go there. But if you could see inside my brain as to how I'm thinking about things, it would be like one of those kind of Hitchcock movies, in the sense of zooming into something and then zooming out to the big picture, right? And then zooming out again to one little section of what I've got going on with my balance and my mix, and then zooming back into the hi-hat, for example, focusing on that in a minute, and then zooming back out. Like, that is, I've thought about this a lot. Like, that is how I operate. Like, you know, I focus on one thing, and I think it's a lot of the secret to my success is that I am able to pick something individually out of 125 inputs. I'm able to pick that one thing out, listen to it for a second, and then ignore it, and now listen to the whole big picture again. But it's a constant, for me, it's a constant zoom. Like, if you could see inside my brain, it's like, whoop, I'm looking at the hi-hat now. Now I'm looking at the drum kit. Now I'm looking at the drum kit with the bass guitar. Now I'm looking at the drum kit, bass guitar, and the things, and ignoring, for instance, you know, like when I'm only looking at the drum kit and the bass guitar, I'm ignoring everything else. Like, I'm not even paying attention to what's happening with guitars and keys and vocals. And like, I don't even hear it really. I am like so focused on like what's happening with the snare drum and the bass guitar. So tell me, is that kind of how you operate, or is there something different going on?
There's a few similar. There are a couple different versions. I can tell you this. If anybody ever happens to come to a show and they see me sitting there like this, and I'm at the center section and I'm doing this, that looks like he's bored, he's pissed. That's the best you could possibly see me, because what that means is I have one hand on the VCAs and I'm just moving. I'm just moving faders, and I'm so incredibly okay with where we are that I'm just pushing stuff back and forth. Like I feel good about all the tonal choices that have been made. That is rare, but that is true. And I've had artists tell me, they're like, "God, you look so bored out there." I'm like, "That's a good thing. That's the best way you can see me, because that means I'm just sitting there, hitting my marks and enjoying the shit out of life." You know, most of the time, the way it works, and it's funny you brought this up, I have an overactive mind. That is an understatement times a bazillion.
I think every mixer is an ADHD kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It never stops. It just never fucking stops. What's good about live sound for me is I have to focus. I have to make decisions. It's happening now. There's no running away. There's no hitting pause. It has to happen. Chris, you've got to fucking make a decision. So live sound kind of forces me to center, you like it or not. And there's definitely the side of me when I'm in the best place that I can be within me, where it's just that. It's hyper focus. And then I pull back to the big picture, which oftentimes is coupled with stepping away a little bit. But in doing that, I'll hyper focus on something. And it's like, and it's not so much that I think we tune everything out. We just know where it is. So we can kind of take a break and go, no, I know I'm good. Like, I don't know about you, but I can mix a guitar solo while I'm working on something else. You know what I mean? Or a key solo, whatever, or a vocal part. I mean, I just know what to do, but I'm actually working on something else. And then I zoom back and look at the big picture. But the reason that I think this is so funny is last weekend or 2 weekends ago or something, I'm sitting at one of my new COVID gigs, which is sitting in a field for the Watkinsville First Baptist Church, which apparently now services are moving back inside as well. Okay. But I'm sitting there, and it's like a cello, a mandolin, an acoustic guitar, a piano, whatever, something. It's not like whatever. That kind of stuff's tough to me, you know, because it's like, what's the anchor? What's the bass? Like that kind of shit's hard. And I'm sitting there, and at one point in time, I'm thinking 50 billion different things, but the recurring thought is, this is not good. I'm not happy with this. And then next thing you know, like a minute and a half later, I just kind of snap out of it. But the whole time I've been moving, the whole time I've been doing stuff. And then I was like, oh no, that's pretty good. And it was almost like I didn't even know how I got there.
Sure.
Like because it's so busy in my head, but it's always so busy in my head, but it's so busy in my head, but I have to do things. Like, that's why I'm there. And I'm just reacting. And then I'm like, oh, that's good. Okay, just leave it for a minute, you know? So there's that
perspective, right? That's perspective of what's happening.
So it's either very analytical or it's just extremely reactive. But when I say reactive, it's reactive coupled with experience. So that I am making moves and almost robotically, you know? But the point that I decide it's good is this pullback moment. I'm like, does that sound like music? Does that feel like, shit, man, taking us to the beginning of this video, does that feel like balance? You know, and that's such a good feeling to be like, wow, yes, it does. And sometimes I kind of don't even know how I got there, you know? So yeah, it's very similar up here. I have a few different versions of how it works, but it's very similar in that, you know, in the implementation of these thoughts, I should say.
Yeah, totally.
You
I mean, it's just weird. It's like, I've thought a lot about how I get to where I am. And you brought up a really good point. And this is why I don't really understand how people adjust their mix day to day as opposed to adjusting the speaker system day to day. And the reason is that for months I have focused in on whatever it is, like talking about the mandolin or whatever, you know, and like made minute adjustments to finally get it to a point where it's like, okay, so finally it's now working in my mix. Mm-hmm. And so everything that's happening in my mix is so precarious. Yes. Like the little minute adjustment is going to make that thing not be cool anymore. Mm-hmm. When you talk to someone that says, well, yeah, I adjust all kinds of things in my mix depending on what day I am on a pair of speakers, it makes no sense to me because I've spent all of that time to get it right to live within my mix, right?
Right. It just seems like too much work. Like, what are you aiming? I don't get it.
I mean, it used to be that way, right? Like, you know, I know when I used to mix, you know, bands and clubs and whatever, and I should drastically change what was happening in my mix because the speaker systems weren't that great anyway. It was literally like trying to figure out how to get clarity and intelligibility out of the vocal enough on top of the, you know, million dB guitar amp that's coming off the stage. Right. You know, that's a different thought process. But nowadays with speaker systems being so good, and even clubs nowadays have these amazing speaker systems, you know, House of Blues and all that kind of stuff. What happens in your mix is so much more important. And to me, so precarious. And it's when when one of those things gets out of whack, that's when I get super frustrated and have to spend a bunch of time with virtual playback earlier on in the day because I'm like, man, that thing is just not what it was, and I can't figure out what it is. And right. I'll chase an individual thing for hours, you know, to try to get it back into the scope of what's happening.
Right.
So I just thought it was interesting, though. You know, I've analyzed a lot of how I work, and you know, like we've said on here, it's like, you know, take whatever you want out of this. I'm just sharing with how my brain works. I'm not saying that's the best way. That's just a way. But you know, as it turns out, most of the time both of you and I tend to agree on those kind of things.
True. I'll tell you something. Just in this discussion, something I wanted to point out. I used to feel better about burying things in a mix, and as time has gone on, I don't quite feel that way. And of course, even in saying that, I'm like, Jesus, this is 30 minutes of conversation. What I mean is, it's twofold. One area where we're kind of screwed is in live sound. There's the visual, and it sucks to have somebody up there hitting a percussion player and you don't hear it. That's the worst. And even if it's like kind of sucks, you're like, fuck, but he's there. You know, I need to put it in there. So there's that aspect of it. Then there's like everything should matter. And again, because and I mean everything instrumentation wise, it should have a role.
That's right. That's right.
But again, in live sound, we have compromised dynamic range or signal to noise. Again, signal to noise, not necessarily dynamic range. We have greater dynamic range than our studio counterparts do often, but our signal to noise is smaller. So at the point that you're putting something here, that might work on the board tape or the studio mix, but it doesn't work in the room. Like we kind of don't have the depth. But you start getting into other things, whereas, you know, maybe that thing I'm talking about flat out doesn't even need to be played, but it's the fourth guitar player who on this song plays a keyboard because they don't want him to leave stage. So there's all these things that go into it. Or I've had this happen many times where there's a part where like the band wants to listen and they're jamming and the artist comes in, they're like, lose that shit. Well, who's doing that? That's terrible. Duck that. And you're like, fuck. All right, here we go. Let's start playing this, you know? But yeah, like tucking things or ducking things. First of all, if it's happening, it should matter. If it's a bad part, then it's an arrangement problem. Then that pisses me off because that's kind of, somebody else sort that out, you know, because I've got to deal with it. The other thought in all of this is, and I've mentioned on here before, a lot of times there's a difference between tucking something and muting something. Because when you tuck it, you put it, it's still part of that. Again, we're cooking. It's still in there. Like it's still doing something, only now it's not clear what it's doing. It's just a problem somewhere in there. It's now like this low mid gunk that you don't quite know where it is. So again, it's the visual that makes me want everything heard all the time, but it's also it should matter. It's being done. You know, we could do it, but sometimes that's not.
We've talked a lot on here before about how our role as a live sound engineer is akin to being a producer in the sense of an arranger, because those are discussions that I have had certainly with a lot of my artists about, you know, hey, that thing that so-and-so is playing is also happening in the playback. And the fact that they're not playing exactly in time it's not helping anybody. And I can't figure out as an engineer where to place that stuff. It just doesn't work. And so that, I think what you're talking about is having a discussion as a producer or an arranger guy to be able to have a discussion with the musical director or the artist and say, you know, hey, that's not working. And it's forcing me to bury it in the mix. And it just doesn't, it looks lame and it sounds lame, you know? So let's come up with a solution arrangement wise to try to fix that. So I don't know about you, but my solution to a lot of what you just talked about is to try to go to the source and get them to change it. Sometimes you don't win. Like sometimes you try and they're just like, nope, that's in there. And then you have to figure out what to do with it. But I just wanted to point out that from my perspective, when that happens to me, my initial reaction is not to figure out what piece of gear is going to fix that or what bearing that is going to make it better or make it more prominent in the mix. Like my initial reaction to that is to, you know, have a discussion with somebody and say, that part's not working. You know, that can get you into trouble. There's people that won't have that discussion with you and you have to read the room. You know, we've certainly had those. We've had a couple of those episodes on here talking about reading the room and when to speak. And, you know, that's when that comes into play. But I just wanted to point out that there are other solutions than just trying to make something that sounds shitty work in your mix. There's other ways to fix it. Right.
Right. And that kind of comes full circle back on all this as far as how do we go about building a mix conceptually before we've pushed anything up. And we can learn the wants and the needs of the artist or the musical director or blah, 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 blah. And we can take all that information, have that information, kind of formulate a game plan. Then we have to assess the performance. And it's those two things that I go, okay, I have this information and then I have this information. You know, I have to have this information and then I have these things. Between those two, what am I doing? You know, hopefully those two line up. Hopefully the theory and the practice of what's coming off stage lines up. And then you really you've already thought about it. You know what you want to do. When they don't line up, that's when all the gear in the world doesn't fucking matter, you know, and that's when it's decision time and or acceptance time. Yeah. You know, and that's a whole other thing. So
it is. You know, one other last thing here, we've come up on our time here, but one last thing that I heard Jack Joseph Puig say, and I've heard him say it before, is that it's only just recent. Now we're talking about a guy that's been making records since 1982, big records, huge records. And he has said that only recently has he discovered that trusting his instinct leads to success. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing in that you should trust your instincts. Like usually when my first thought process of how to make something better in a mix is usually the thing that I land on after messing with it for 2 hours. I usually kind of come back to the first instinct that I had as to what should happen to that thing. And so I thought that was a really interesting comment as well, is that, you know, trust your instincts. And if you, you know, your experience and your instincts should tell you right away how to fix things. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. That is, it's kind of surprising to hear him say that, because it's like, yes, do that,
Yeah.
but it's even easier to second guess your instincts. And it a lot of times too, we feel like we need to, like I say, that this is a problem I see big time in pop music, where there's this culture that if you're not working frantically, you're not working hard.
Right.
And I don't see that in other genres. I see very calculated, experience-based decisions and processes, And so the same thing can happen where if you pull up an input and you've got 3 thoughts and you perform those 3 thoughts, it's like, was that really it? Shouldn't I have to work on this more? And sometimes you're like, well, surely that can't be right. And it goes back to your thing of the like reassessing on a nightly basis. How many times do you reassess every goddamn night and come back to the exact same spot?
Oh man.
Same thing in playback, same thing. It's like at a certain point, and then it's just, it is what it is, So, but your instincts will guide you for sure.
Totally. But what you described, that whole chasing your tail the entire time, is also what makes you good. It's also because, yes, there are times where we end up right back where we are. And, that may happen the majority of the time we end up right back where we are. But it's the times when we don't end up right back where we are and we improve it just this little bit that makes, that makes you a better mixer than so-and-so. It's that you're never going to let it beat you, man. You keep working on it. It's the hardest thing for me is I don't understand how mixers that release records know when they're done. Like, how do they know when something's done? I don't. Whenever I mix a record, I always I'm telling you, when I hear a record that I worked on in the 90s that is on the radio today, and if I'm driving down the road and that song comes on, I listen to it and I go, man, that one thing I wish I could fix, and that's part of what makes live sound so much fun, is that, it's a battle every night and we keep chipping away at it during the tour. And so much so I even, I don't know if we've talked about this, but I will chip away at something and feel like I've gone in the wrong direction and recall a show from 6 shows ago.
Oh, definitely. To
start again. It's almost like rebalancing.
Well, it's inevitable. And we've talked about hurting those cats, which just all goes back to turn the bass up a little. Oh, that 2 dB bump just set everything off. Yeah. And so you got one of 2 ways. Either it's coming back down or everything else is coming up. Then what happens?
Figure out a way. Yeah, has to figure out a way.
What about this? What about the emotional roller coaster of a set list? As far as fuck, that one's coming up. God damn it, every night I struggle with it. And then you hit the one that's just it's so easy, and no matter what venue you're showing off every night. Man. It's it is such a, God,
It's so funny. There is one song, and I won't tell you what song it is, but there's
I'm thinking of
song
right now. Love
man, the world. There's one song in Iron Maiden that I get to every night because they've been playing the same set list for 3 years now or whatever. They do 3 years of basically the same set, and then it's a record cycle of the same set. So I get to that same song every night and just go, and it's not that it's horrible. It's that it's it's nobody else is noticing what I'm noticing, but literally I get to that song every night and just go, what is it about this? I can't get it.
I know. So, I know, man. Anyway, I know.
Cool. Yep. All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in. Please tell all your friends, tell them to subscribe, and be safe out there. Thanks for coming.
All right. See you, everybody.
Bye.